Hey, Anita, how are you?
I am doing great.
Well, thanks again for being here today and making this happen. Welcome to the Ozark Mountain Author Series. And so I'm excited to talk to all the authors and just have them tell me a little bit about their books and explain how they got the process started, tell me about themselves and things like that. So today is your turn, and I'm excited to find out what you have to say. So your book is called, how do you pronounce it? Is it Twiddler?
Almost. It's called Twitters.
Twitters. Okay, I'm
It's a
sorry.
combination of
I'm
a
glad
whole
you clarified. Say it one more time.
it's a combination of a whole bunch of terms that we'll get into in a minute, I'm sure.
Okay, good deal. Well, so I guess let's get started. Please tell me a little bit more about yourself and how things began for you, and then eventually we'll get into the book.
You bet. Well, I am the parent of six remarkable children, three biological blondes, and three adopted brunettes. And getting those brunettes raised to be the wonderful people they are meant that I had to secure some very special parenting skills, which ended up in my being a special education teacher, which I absolutely loved. It was the passion of my life. I'm now retired, but after my husband passed away many years ago, I couldn't beat the teacher retirement system in Alaska. It was just head over heels better than any other state. So by then I was just down to my two youngest children, and we traveled all the way up to the final frontier. And I taught the first year in the bush in a village called Tanana, right on the shores of the Yukon. But thereafter, I taught for the Fairbanks School District in the interior. So we lived in North Pole, Alaska. And yes, that is where Santa Claus House is. And you can see him 356 days of the year. He's wonderful. And as a teacher at a high school in Fairbanks, October was like the wildest, craziest, funnest year, or funnest month for teachers ever, because we would always come up with wild and crazy units that we could only do that month. And so for my English classes, I would always come up with something that was just totally off the wall that I could create little units around for reading, writing, and research. And for instance, one year it was cryptozoology. And this year, in particular, it was purportedly true ghost stories of the far north. And I'd gone into the Noel Wien Library in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I had checked out every book they had on Alaskan ghost stories. And it took a while, but I read through every one of those volumes, collecting and setting aside the experiences that I thought the student really be interested in and that I could work into a meaningful and fun unit for them for October. And in one of the volumes, I'm reading along about this couple from Washington State who were on the cruise of a lifetime with another couple who were their good friends. And the cruise had gone up the left leg of Alaska, and they'd stopped at historic places like Skagway and Juneau, and they ended up in Anchorage. And it was a day trip in Anchorage, so they got off of the cruise ship and they were looking at Old Town and going in this store and that, and they ended up in the old Anchorage Hotel, which had been built in the 1930s, but it actually ended up vacant for many years, and then finally was uh, sold off to a developer who brought it up to late 1900s standards, all modern, all beautiful, all comfortable for folks to stay there. And so they were wandering through the gift shop getting gifts for the grandchildren. And the one gal I'll just call her Mrs. Smith. I don't remember her name. But Mrs. Smith said, oh gosh, I've got to use the restroom. I'll be right back. So her husband and their good friends, the other couple, just kind of messed around in the gift shop for a little longer. And then they wandered out into the hallway of the hotel. And about that time, Mrs. Smith came hopping down the hallway, just all excited. And she said to her lady friend, you have got to follow me. You won't believe what they've done. They have totally made this main restroom on the floor here retro. There are oak stalls. There are gas lights. There are no hand dryers. She said, I was standing there and a woman dressed up in a maid uniform, like from the 1930s, came in and handed me a real cotton towel to dry my hands on. She said, it is the cutest thing I've ever seen. So her lady friend followed her and they went down the hall, went into the restroom that she just exited. And it was nothing like that. It was all new. It was chrome fixtures. It was metal stalls. It was hand dryers. And she just about fainted. And that was her account of what had happened. And they couldn't figure it out. And I'm sitting here reading that, going, what the heck has that got to do with ghosts? There were no ghosts in that story. What was that? What did that woman experience? It was like she walked into the past for a few minutes. And that was my introduction to something called time slips, or more accurately, space-time slips. Because as Einstein proved, space and time are one entity. They're not two separate things. They're totally interwoven, 1000%. And once I had that introduction to this fascinating subject of time slips, and what a remarkable thing it was for a person to experience, it was like these experiences just kept falling in my lap. No matter where I was reading or I was listening to a show on TV or a podcast on my computer, I kept coming across experiences that I would have termed space-time slips. And after I compiled a whole file full of these experiences, I decided this is so cool. This is so fascinating. This is utterly mind-blowing. I need to put these things together and share them with whoever in the world might be interested. So that's how I came about to compile the book known as Twitters.
So, is there anything in particular that really stood out to you? Or is pretty much, I mean, everything is just this exciting thing to just be researched and looked at?
That is a really great question. And I think even the greatest physicist in the world would not give you a real good answer because we don't have it yet. But I actually did read a number of books on physics, trying to come to some sort of understanding as to how a space-time slip could occur. And over the course of that research, and then also the continued compilation of other experiences that I would come across, I discovered two things. A person can experience a shift in time, usually back to the past, but it could be forward to the future. It also could be a fast forward experience, and I'll give you examples of these later, or a so slow experience. Or what I also discovered was that sometimes it had nothing to do with time, but it had everything to do with location that people were experiencing. The book is full of experiences, and I'll get to those. But how it can happen, it appears that it has to do with a number of things. It has to do with portals or wormholes. It has to do with the fact that time is only a construct that us in mortality refer to track change. But there really is, as Einstein proved, no time, which absolutely boggles our mind because it's really a fourth dimension concept. When you can reach the speed of light and enter the fourth dimension, keeping in mind we live in the third dimension, time as we know it ceases. If I was to enter the fourth dimension today, I would not age another nanosecond. As we understand aging and time in the third dimension, immortality. It has to do also with another concept that physicists have come up with in the last few decades, which is parallel universes or multiverses. And I think one of the most graphic explanations that helped me to grasp this concept is one by one physicist where he compared the parallel universes or realities to pieces of paper fluttering around in the breeze. And now and then, two pieces of paper might touch. And in that brief second, a space-time slip can occur. And if a human is nearby to where that occurs, they're going to experience it. I actually did something that you'll find experiences that folks have had in space-time slips in all sorts of books. One was an autobiography by an actress that I found a space-time slip. And of course, she had no idea what to term it, but she had experienced it while she was in Israel on a trek to her ancestors' homeland there. I'll find one on a podcast listening to either the host or an interviewee. And while many people have included space-time slip experiences in books, they've never categorized them. And that was the one thing I thought needed to happen to help us to understand these experiences. And so I actually categorized them by back to the past, forward to the future, fast forward, so slow, instant replay, lost locations, alternate reality. And by doing that with these experiences, I felt like, while maybe I didn't know anymore how they happened, I could understand the nature of what the person was undergoing and slip what they had felt or experienced into a category. I never experienced a space-time slip that had to do with going back to the past or forward to the future, but I have experienced an alternate reality. And mine was just the year before I went up to teach in Alaska, which was 1999. We were living in southern Utah, just 15 miles south of Cedar City. And there is the most gorgeous area east of Cedar City. You go up, there's only one road from Cedar City up to Duck Creek and the old pines up there. So you go up that road, and there's a beautiful little creek named Duck Creek. The waters are ice cold. They're snow fed. And there is a road, one road, that takes you off of the main road going west to east out of Cedar City, up Cedar Breaks, and it takes you north to a lake that is about 25 miles north of the cutoff at Cedar Breaks. And my children and our hybrid wolf, Juno, he was Siberian Husky and Arctic wolf. You know, the Arctic wolves are the only ones that have brown eyes. And he had the brown eyes and the white fur. the magnificent creature, and gentle as can be, even though he was a hybrid wolf. But he would always accompany the children and I and any friends up to this road that intersected the road to Cedar Breaks. We went up there many times in the summer because it would go north, and on the west side was a hill with the most beautiful stand of quaking aspen, which are my absolute favorite tree in the world. And there was a little bridge going over the road or along the road for a creek that came down from this stand of quaking aspen on the west side of the road going north. We would always bring a picnic lunch. We would sit out next to the edge of the creek, flowing east from the trees, and dangle our feet in there. And Juno, the hybrid wolf, he'd frolic in the creek, and then he'd come up and he'd mooch food off of us. And the kids, the last time we went there, my friend Anne took pictures of us all, including the hybrid wolf, halfway in the creek. Well, the very next time we went up there was almost 3 months later, and I had friends from Juneau, Alaska, who'd come down to visit. And one day we devoted to going up to Cedar Breaks and Duck Creek and the going north and stopping for a picnic lunch along our favorite stand of quaking aspen and that wonderful little creek. The only problem was we couldn't find it. There's exactly one road that intersects the Cedar Breaks Road that goes north up to the lake. And we went up and down that road 3 times looking for the little bridge and the creek. We could see the stand of quaking aspen and the hill it was on, but there was no bridge and there was no creek. And finally, the children had just had it. They were so hungry and tired of riding in the car that we went back to Duck Creek and had our lunch there. And unfortunately, I've never had an opportunity to go back there since then. I do look forward to that someday because I want to know which was my reality. The reality with the bridge and the creek, or the reality with no bridge and no creek.
So, I mean, would you say that these happenings always more of this external occurrence, or do you find it that it also has something to do with us as well?
Well, I wondered about Carl Jung and the other historian who experienced what they did twice. And I don't know what to tell you about them, except that Jung was so immersed in the history of the area in Greece, where he had his 2 space-time slips, that I wondered if maybe that was a contributing factor to it. But often when people experience a space-time slip, no matter what kind it is, they'll enter fog, or there'll be a really strong thunderstorm. So electricity seems to be a part of it. Also, fog is often a part of a person entering into an experience like that. But I can give you another example of an alternate reality, which still sends shivers up my spine. And this was in my book, Twitters. It was a fella who was working as a counselor for a youth group, and he'd done it a number of summers. And this was up in pretty wild country, like most youth camps are for summertime experiences. And they were at the top, their camp was at the top of a canyon. And this was his 3rd summer working with a group of kids there. And they would hike down about a mile below them, right in the canyon, was a a religious youth camp, and they also held summer camp there every summer. And so now and then they'd get together with the kids down at the gospel camp, and they'd either hike together or have a meal together or make s'mores, whatever. And this was their third week at camp, and they decided it was almost dinner time. They were just gonna, and the canyon that went from their upper camp to the gospel camp about a mile below, there were no openings. He said it was an easy walk because there was a really nice, well-defined trail, but it was like there were cliffs on either side of the trail. So it wasn't like you were going to deviate or get lost from hiking down to the gospel youth camp. And they got about part way down to the gospel youth camp, and all of a sudden, to one side, one of the kids noticed this beautiful meadow that no one had ever seen before. And there was a river running through it. And they decided, he thought something was really weird, but he thought, well, maybe I've just never noticed before. So they deviated from their hike down the canyon to the gospel camp, and they turned off and followed this river and the meadow. But he said the farther they got, the stranger and the more wrong it felt. And finally, he told the kids, we're turning around. This isn't right. We're turning around. And they all went back, got back on the canyon trail, went down to the youth camp, visited for a bit, and then they headed back up to their camp. And when they reached the spot where they had turned off into the meadow and followed the river, there was nothing but canyon wall.
Oh, wow.
So what would have, this is what sends chills up my spine. What would have happened if they had not turned back? Would they have
So,
been?
I mean, were there all the reactions from these different stories that you have? Were there always, things for people that were just bewildered and it's afraid of what had happened, or is it kind of a mixed bag?
Well put. Often a mixed bag. Most often they're bewildered and awestruck, but definitely befuddled. For instance, one of my favorite Back to the Past experiences included in Twitter's was this young gal. She was 10 years old. They were living out in kind of a country setting, and her mother sent her, I mean, this was back in the days when you could walk down the road. You could send a 10-year-old by themselves a couple miles down the road to the store and not worry about some sicko picking them up. So she walked down the road, which she'd done many times before for her mom, to go get her a couple things at the store. And she got halfway down and she noticed a house to the right, with a dog and some chickens in the yard. And then there was a little girl who looked about 10 years old to her. And the little girl called out to her and waved her hand and said, "Hi, how you doing?" And she said, "You want to come play with me for a bit?" And she said, "Well, okay." And she went into their yard. It was a cute little cottage. Worked her way through the chickens and the dog, and she and this new playmate had a great time. Playmate's mother came out and invited her to lunch, and she said, what I remembered most about the lunch was my family was really, really poor, and we were lucky to have a meal 3 times a day. But her mom had such a spread laid out for us. It was so yummy, she said. And they played a little more after they ate lunch, but then she started feeling guilty and thought maybe her mom was getting worried about her. So she thanked the little girl and said, "I'll be back and play tomorrow. How's that?" And she went down to the store and then trotted back home. And when she got to the spot where the cottage and the creatures and the other little girl had been, there was nothing. She said there wasn't even a chicken feather. And as a 10-year-old, she wasn't afraid, but boy, was she confused as to what had happened. And she'd never forgotten it. and she had told her granddaughter what she had experienced that day.
There's often I hear people talk about. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, called the Mandela effect,
Yeah.
and so I've heard that a lot of times. I don't know. I guess because of these two different, and for those that are not familiar, let me just quickly explain. Basically, the Mandela effect is that um, an event that we all believe had happened.
Oh,
Some remember it one way, where others remember a different way. And
oh,
so, a lot of times when stories like yours that you brought up, and when I have conversations with people, they always want to attribute that to the Mandela effect. But I personally am not quite sure that that's the same thing. I don't know what your thoughts
yeah,
are about that.
I agree. I agree. I was really careful with the accounts I keep and consider space-time slips because a lot of them I felt were made up or were wishful thinking on folks' parts, or were obviously someone just playing a joke. And so I don't attribute the Mandela effect to the accounts I hold on to and consider accurate. But there was one fellow who, um, I don't know if you're acquainted with Roald Amundsen. In the early
Mm.
1900s, there was this big race between Britain and the Scandinavian fellow, Roald Amundsen, to make it to the South Pole first. I don't know if you know anything about that.
I've heard of it, but I don't know any details.
Well, to make a long story short, the Brits suffered from a very bad case of pride, and they were very ill prepared for that trek. Whereas Amundsen, who'd spent years as an explorer and had lived with Eskimo and knew everything about from how to dress in Arctic temperatures to how to have food caches, how to use sled dogs, how to ski, all the things the Brits knew nothing about, but they were just going to soldier on and by golly, they were going to win the race. It For Amundsen and his crew, not only did they make it first to the South Pole, they ended up gaining weight because they were so careful in their food caches that they had prepared ahead of time, and in the clothing, and in the sleds they used, and their abilities to ski. Whereas the British team ended up, for some reason, they thought Shetland ponies should be used in the Antarctic instead of
Mm,
sled dogs, and of
right.
course they ended up dying, and they ended up pulling their sledges themselves, and all of them on the trek back died. And there was one of the first fellows to die, knew he didn't have long to live, and when his compatriots were in the tent for the night, he said, there's something I just need to do. And he left the tent and never came back. And in hindsight, they had written in their journal, they knew he'd done that to save him from a little bit of the horror of him passing away in the
Mm.
tent with them. And they never did find his body. And this fellow who had this space time slip experience, or kind of like a Mandela effect, he had actually picked up a newspaper and read how they had finally found the body of this guy. And they'd brought him back to Britain, and they'd held a special service to commemorate it. Well, years down the road, he's listening to a report on television that that guy's body has still never been found. So, was he hallucinating when he read the newspaper? I don't think so. He had so many details in what he was describing. I think it was an alternate reality where they did find this one Brit's body frozen in the Antarctic and brought it home, as opposed to our reality, where in fact he's still somewhere in the Antarctic and his body
Well,
has never been found.
right. I feel like I need to also just finish describing this real quick because I realized I still didn't explain why it's even called Mandela effect. So what I was just trying to say earlier, that Nelson Mandela, some remember him dying in prison,
Yeah.
others remember him basically, getting out of prison, becoming this president of South Africa. So that's why it's called the Mandela effect. I just didn't
Yes.
clarify that. I stopped, not really explaining like, okay, what's Mandela got to do with time slips or different memories of different happenings.
Thank you for explaining that fully.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was aware of that.
Well, especially with people watching, that it's mainly for them. I don't know. You probably already knew that, but I was like, oh wait, I just didn't finish explaining that all the way. It kind of adds more to all the different mysteries. I mean, as if we don't have enough on this planet about, maybe it's unfortunate that sometimes like science, they concentrate on things that they can get some results from eventually because of funding and all these other things that support their research. So there's not much room to like, hey, here's so many hundreds or thousands or millions of dollars to just research something like that, for example. Like, is a time slip possible or what's going on? It's like you're hardly ever going to find somebody investing money for research like that. So that's why sometimes science is great, but it's so limited because of money. Maybe the scientists individually might have an interest of like, oh, that would be so cool for me to find out, but I can't talk about it because of funding. I can't research it because of funding. So I would think that it's unfortunate that then there's constantly this war between people that are scientists and not scientists about, well, why aren't you exploring this? Why aren't you doing this? But at the end of the day, it really is unfortunate that they're just stuck by the dictation of money. To where if somebody's more scientifically inclined, it's like, hey, use your brain to figure this out if you desire it. But most of them don't. They just kind of stay to whatever is the mainstream and whatever would eventually give a result or give some kind of outcome to where the investors can say, oh, okay, our money well spent.
And space and portals or wormholes are pretty esoteric. We know that wormholes exist, it's been proven, but to control them and to be able to access them whenever we so choose, that's not right around the corner, and I can't imagine funding for it.
Well, I think eventually, one of the side effects of, for example, propulsion, which always the military and different aspects of the government always looking into new ways for rockets, new ways for any kind of new propulsion that's more modern and not so outdated, like just some kind of liquid fuel. And so maybe it's a good thing that the more they push on that end, the more, for example, they will inevitably hit that wall of wormholes, or time warp, whatever it takes you. Because after a while, when you're flying, Mach 9, Mach 10, and all these very high speeds, weird things happen, and so, so maybe it's inevitable that they will eventually get to it. But here they are doing it for research reasons, for better propulsion, not realizing they might help us get some answers on all these other mysteries.
And it's funny how there's overlap in some of the mysteries. If I was a psychiatrist, I'd call it comorbidity, which is where you have overlap of these things. It has nothing to do with death. It's just overlap of these things. And another phenomenon that appears to end up in space-time slips is electronic fog, which is something that pilots have experienced, especially around the Bermuda Triangle. And again, they will find themselves in a cloud that travels with them and they don't seem to be able to get out of. And they will end up where they were headed hours ahead of time and with only minimal amount of fuel spent. And pilots call that experience in the atmosphere electronic fog. And so that's another form that I think we can lump with space-time slips, because something alters what we know as time. But I have to add a little caveat here. Since Twitter's has come out, I have continued to gather literally hundreds of accounts that I've come across. And I have to say that there's one other type of experience that I lump into space-time slips, but I think it's actually a heavenly experience. And I do believe in the fourth dimension. I do believe that life goes on forever, that we're just here in mortality for a nanosecond of eternity, and that we go on when our mortal body ceases, our spirit body continues, and heaven knows I believe in angels. And this account I came across, you'll have to let me know what you think. Maybe it was an alternate reality, but it was such a kind thing for this young mother. I think it was an angel at work. Young couple living in New York City. Her husband was working part-time, going to college full-time. They had their first baby, a beautiful little girl. They were living in a basement apartment, barely making ends meet. And that little baby was a joy to them, but she was also born colicky. She virtually cried 24/7. And it was so hard to ever have a quiet, peaceful moment with her. And her mother felt her pain, and she also felt terribly caught being in the basement apartment and not being able to help her daughter be really happy. Nevertheless, she adored her. And one of the things that really made her daughter happy for a brief period of time, by this time she was a little over 6 months old, was mom had a little buggy that or stroller, she would put her 6-month-old daughter in. And on a good day, they'd walk down the New York City streets. And one day they were walking down the street and they got to this, that she'd been on this route many times with her baby in the stroller, but she went all the way down this block-long brick building. And she thought, well, I've never gone right at this corner. Let's go right. And she turned right, and that side of the brick building was 100% brick. No doors, no windows, like on the front. So she decided she'd walk down to the end of the block, then they'd turn around and make their way home. She got halfway down the block of this solid brick side of the building, and there was a doorway. And it was a toy shop. And she thought, well, how fun is that? She brought her daughter and her stroller into the toy shop, and her daughter had been happy because she loved to walk. I mean, she loved to be outside on walks with her mama in her stroller, and the sunshine and the wind and the bird sounds all made her happy. So they went into the toy shop, and it was just tables like you could get at Costco that you bend the legs down and set them up, that was in the shop. But the tables were filled with toys, all sorts of toys. And so the mom was taking her little 6-month-old up and down the aisles in the stroller. And on one of the tables, there was a carousel. And mom picked up the carousel, and on the bottom was a little metal wind-up, and it would play a song, and the horses would go around. And her daughter was in seventh heaven. She grabbed onto that toy and wouldn't let go of it. She was so happy. She was giggling for the first time in her life. And so mom managed to look at the bottom of it at the price. It was $7. She had exactly $10 in her purse. She walked up to the little old man who was behind the cash register, and she bought it. And he said, I'm sure it will give you many, many happy days, and your daughter will continue to enjoy it. And she thanked him, and they went back home. And that was a turning point in her daughter's life. She would, instead of crying and fussing, she would play with that carousel for hours on end. And it entirely changed her entire demeanor. And so a few weeks later, another payday, few extra bucks in her purse, she decided to take her daughter, sunny summer day. They were going to stroll back down to that toy shop and see what else they could find. But when they turned the corner and went down that solid brick side of the building, there was no door. There was no toy shop. And so it might have been an alternate reality, but I like to think that was angels at work helping
You
that
know,
mom.
as you're telling that, there's two things that would then come to mind. So then, one aspect of it is, well, if we can travel through time or do a slip, that means then if there are others that we're not aware of, they should be able to have the same experiences, probably interacting with us. And two, it goes back to the original question I was having, whether or not it's the environment or us. How would the environment, for example, if it's supposed to be more inanimate, know that it would help help her, for example, having that toy? So I'm saying maybe it also has more to do, with each individual's person experience or energy, in some way or form.
I'm sure you're right about that. That makes sense.
Well, because why would you see what I mean? Because then, by that sense, then it could have been any experience, right? But
Mhm.
but why particularly that one that would then soothing her and really help her? You
Right,
know, because if it was so accidental, I guess is the word.
right.
You know,
It was serendipitous. I like that better
yeah,
than accidental.
right, right,
Yeah, and
right.
why it happened to her, and I'm sure there were many other mothers in New York City with colicky babies, and yet it didn't happen to them. You just got to take the good and be grateful for it when it happens.
Right. Well, is there any other stories that very stuck with you that you would like to share?
Well, she was leaving her driveway to drive 1 mile to town. This was in an evening, so it was dark out. There were woods and a few houses along the way. She writes, I just pulled out, and there was a thick fog rolling in. It was a very creepy night. I had only gone half a block at most, very slowly through the fog so I didn't run off the road, when I saw a bright light. This was very strange since there was nothing near my house. As I drove closer, I saw it was a Phillips 66 gas station. It wasn't there the day before. I pulled into it in shock, and a man came out. I asked him how a gas station could have been built so fast, and he looked at me strangely. He said it had been there for 8 years. I asked him where I was, and when he told me, I began to shake uncontrollably. I was 300 miles from home. I looked at the clock. I had left my driveway only 2 minutes before. It took me the rest of the night to drive home.
Man, I wish most of my trips would be that quick.
Every time I get on a plane, I wish that would happen.
Oh,
My bad, bad.
right.
And then there's another type of space time slip that I referred to called an instant replay. And this one is just funny. It was from the early 1940s. And I'm just going to paraphrase here. The family's name was Hawkins, and it was in southeastern portion of rural Alabama in the 1920s. And it was this gal's grandma telling her what they'd experienced. It was a hot summer day, about this time of year, because they were shelling peas. Heaven knows I've been picking peas from my garden lately. But Mrs. Hawkins and a number of the neighbor ladies were all together on their front porch of their country home, shelling peas together, talking. And Mr. Hawkins had gone to town for some flour, and he was riding the family mule. And they watched him as he came back. He got right up to the gate to come into the yard, and he disappeared. And the women, of course, were totally flabbergasted. They didn't know what to make of it. They knew it wasn't a mass hallucination. They knew they weren't all nuts, but they never had anything like that happen in their lives before. And a few minutes later, up the road comes Mr. Hawkins on the mule, gets right up to the gate, and this time opens the gate and rides the mule into the yard. So Mr. Hawkins got home before he actually did. So that is an instant replay. And again, it all goes back to the fact that there is no time. And it's interesting. To throw something else really odd in here is near-death experiences. When I love to read near-death experiences and see the glimpses of the next step in life that folks have seen who have come back from such an experience. And so often they will talk about going through a life review. And it's not like reading a book where you go from page to page to page to page, reading the story of their life. They always describe it as everything from before they were born, still in the womb, to the second when their heart stopped beating for whatever reason and they entered the spirit world. It was all there, all at the same moment, all at the same time. And that's because when we enter the fourth dimension, we understand the true nature of time, that there is no past, present, or future. It's all the same. And to try to wrap our mind around it, there was one physicist who described it like this. He calls it the great now. And he said, just think of a book. Yeah, you read it. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But now cut off the spine and throw all the pages on the ground. The whole story is right there, right at the same time, now. And that is the true nature of reality. And no, we can't wrap our minds around it, immortality, but we can trust that these people have figured these things out.
That's a great analogy.
I loved it when I read that. It helped me understand. So anyway, I loved the story about Mr. Hawkins and his mule appearing before they actually arrived at home.
Yeah, that would be kind of freaky having to experience that in person, because it messes with your mind. It's like, what in the world did I just witness?
I'm having a senior moment, but there was a podcaster who just this last season, I was listening to him describe something that happened to him when he was a little boy. He walked into his kitchen, and there was this guy, this grown-up, eating a peanut butter sandwich, and he'd never seen the guy before. And as he was looking at him in shock, the guy disappeared. Years later, the podcaster says, I was in my kitchen, had made a peanut butter sandwich, was taking a bite out of it, when this little kid walked into my kitchen, stared at me with his mouth open, shock, and disappeared. So he was seeing himself.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. That's really,
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I want to wish that on somebody to experience or not, because again, it goes back to how they view it.
Yeah, there are experiences that I think, well, how many people do we read about who just disappear every year? Tens of thousands of people worldwide. And I've often wondered, maybe a portion of those are people who did walk into another reality and didn't turn around and come back. Like there was one account that I've come across and held on to about this girl. She was about 12 years old, sharing a room with her 8-year-old brother. And one night, she, well, I think it was almost morning, she had awakened. And when she went to bed, there in the floor, her bed and her brother's bed was like this big hole. And when she looked into the hole, she could see adult people working. She said it was like a factory of some sort. And it was like she was in the ceiling. And at the edge of the hole, there was a ladder going down. And she said for a brief moment, she thought of climbing down that ladder. But she didn't. And the hole closed up and went away.
That's interesting.
So what would have happened if she had climbed down the ladder and that wormhole had closed? Would her parents have then spent the rest of their lives in utter misery trying to figure out what happened to their 12-year-old?
Yeah, these are very interesting and exciting things to entertain. But I would keep thinking back on just how there's so much I guess limitation on our minds and what we want or can perceive. Just something very simple that in my personal experience, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was just so, I don't know, it's just strange. You have to think about it. The brain would react this way. And it was, when I was little, my grandfather was very dear to me. We would always, walk, and he would, have his little radio, which I have to this day, and he would, I would walk with him, not understanding what in the world they're talking about there. And he would listen to it, and we'd just go out for these walks. Well, he had passed away, in the 90s. Well, this was, I was originally born in Bosnia, but grew up in Germany. So when we went back to Bosnia to visit, I really wasn't aware that he had another brother. So my mom says, let's go to your grandpa's, brother's house. I was like, oh, okay. I was excited. Another family member I literally didn't know he existed. Well, I was standing by the gate, and she's kind of jokingly making an announcement. Here we come. Something, because they haven't seen him for well over 20 years. Well, he walked out the door, and I got the chill down the spine, and my legs almost gave out because I thought I saw my grandfather. They looked so similar, to each other, but it was so weird that my brain and mind reacted in that manner. I think I was 16, and so it just wasn't anything, ghost related, anything, supernatural. It was simply a brother of somebody that I found very dear in my life, that it felt like he was back alive again.
Right.
And so it was just this weird for a few seconds, and then kind of, as they say, reality kicked in, and I calmed down, and it's like, it's not him, but it was very nice to see somebody resembling those features.
Yeah, and to me, that's just as treasured an experience as if it had been a space-time slip.
Right.
And how do you know your grandfather wasn't right behind him?
Right. Yep.
So might have felt his spirit.
Well, who knows? Maybe one day we'll all figure all our mental perceptions and issues out, and we'll be, enlightened beings, and not the human beings we're today.
I like how you think. I like to think that way too.
Well, Anita, thanks again very much for doing this with me today and for the interview. I believe I have the links that I can, and of course were links for Ozark, for your book and whatnot. But if there's any other contact information or any specific social media website you'd like to leave me with, please go ahead and announce.
That does it. In my old age, in my retirement. But I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of the remarkable accounts that I've come across. I love life, and I love knowing that we have a fascinating universe we live in. It never gets
Well,
old.
it's it's very exciting to have this collection of all these very because it's one thing to say, okay, this is made up story, for example, that you can read for entertainment. It's something entirely different, knowing like these are recalled occurrences, and then it adds another level of just this mystique to to just want to draw you in to read more about it. So it's kind of like kids always want to hear stories or ghost stories or things like that kind of get them on that emotional roller coaster.
Exactly. I like how you think.
Well, Anita, it was good talking to you today. Thanks very much, and we'll do this again sometimes.
Thank you so very much.
All right.
Take
Well,
care
you
of that
take care.
beautiful family.
Oh, we'll do. Take care.
Bye-bye.